The teacups were still warm. I had just poured the chamomile, his favorite. The almond cookies I'd baked last night were untouched, neatly arranged on the porcelain plate with blue tulips around the rim. It was 7 p.m., exactly the time Thomas usually walked through the door with his soft, "Hey, sweetheart," and the click of the lock behind him. Only now there was no sound. Just me, and silence thick enough to press against my chest. My name is Caroline Harper. I'm 46, and I live, or used to live, in a two-story colonial in a sleepy little corner of Madison, Wisconsin. This was Thomas's house. I always called it that, even after he passed. Not because he asked me to, because it felt true. We met when I was working at a local bookstore, and he was ordering rare car manuals. He wasn't flashy, just gentle. That's what caught me. His calm voice, his way of making small things feel important. Like how he always asked if I'd eaten, or how he kissed the top of my head when I worried too much about things that didn't matter. But now he was gone. It had been 3 months since the heart attack. No warning, no goodbye. Just a phone call from the paramedics and a blurry ride to the hospital where I sat under humming lights and filled out forms I don't even remember signing. Everyone says grief comes in waves. But for me, it came in a fog. One that crept into the corners of our home and curled up next to me at night. I wore his sweatshirt to sleep. I let his razor sit untouched in the bathroom. I couldn't open his closet. I wasn't ready. I thought that, maybe, if I left things just the way they were, the silence would start to feel like presence. But it didn't. That evening, I stared at the tea. It had cooled. "Caroline," I whispered to myself, "you can't keep doing this." I wasn't sure what I meant, just that I needed something, a step, even a small one. So I stood up and walked to the back porch, where the garage sat like a forgotten sibling behind the house. Thomas's domain. I rarely went in there. He kept his tools, spare parts, and boxes of God knows what inside. I used to joke that it was his little museum. The wood was chipped, the white paint peeling off like old wallpaper. It hadn't been touched since the funeral. I opened the side door, and the familiar scent hit me. Motor oil, old pine, the faint sweetness of cherry tobacco from his old pipe, long abandoned in a drawer. The light flickered when I pulled the chain. Dust danced in the golden beam like tiny ghosts. His workbench was still cluttered, but everything was in its place. Thomas had a way of making chaos look intentional. I saw the corner where he'd stored his old Mustang project, 1967 fastback, deep blue, half restored, still missing a windshield. He used to spend hours there, humming old Johnny Cash songs while sanding down the hood. I ran my fingers along the car. The metal was cool. For a moment, it felt like touching his shoulder. Then I whispered, "I should sell this place." It came out before I could stop it, like a confession. And as soon as I said it, something shifted in me. Thomas didn't leave a will. Everything had passed to me, legally. But emotionally, that was different. The garage was the last part of him I hadn't touched, the last room that still belonged to him. But I needed to move on. The house was too big. The bills were growing, and I was still trying to understand our accounts. Selling the garage separately, maybe even the car, might help. The next morning, I called a local real estate agent, young, sharp, he lived fast. She had clear eyes and a voice that felt like iced coffee. Efficient, unsentimental. I showed up, walked in on it. "It's got good bones," she said. "Probably has good food. But these kinds of properties, they're rare, especially in the car." I was still watching for the hint. "I can list it tomorrow. Should I schedule some viewings?" I hesitated. Then I said, "Yes, let's list it." She smiled. "You'll be surprised. These things go fast." But when the first potential buyer came, A man in his 50s, with sun-leathered skin and a southern drawl. Something odd happened. He barely looked at the garage, didn't ask about the wiring or the roof. Instead, he stared at the car. "Where'd your husband get this?" he asked, squinting. I paused. "He said he found it at an auction years ago." The man nodded slowly, then shook his head like he'd changed his mind about something. "I'm gonna pass." He didn't explain why. The next one was a couple. Friendly. They asked about square footage, looked inside, and then froze when they saw the workbench. The woman stepped closer to the drawers, as if she'd seen something familiar. Then she turned around, gave a polite smile, and said, "It's not quite what we're looking for." 3 more visitors came. 3 more walked away quickly. It didn't make sense. Until that evening, when I opened the top drawer of the workbench, looking for a screwdriver, and found something that didn't belong. A key, small, brass, cold to the touch. And underneath it, a folded piece of paper with Thomas's handwriting, faded but still steady. It said one word. That one word, "sorry," sat in my hand like it weighed 100 pounds. I read it over and over again, searching for something more, something beneath the ink. But there was nothing, no explanation, just the key and that one word. Almost like he knew I'd find it, but didn't dare to say more. I placed the key in my pocket and sat on the workbench stool. My hands were shaking. Thomas wasn't a secretive man. Or at least, I didn't think he was. We'd been married for 17 years. Long enough to know the contours of someone's habits, the way they chew, sigh, lie. Or so I thought. This key didn't fit anything in our house that I could recall. Not the file cabinet, not the attic lockbox, not the old shed. I'd tried them all. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the key on the nightstand, staring at it through the moonlight, trying to quiet the creeping feeling in my chest. By the next morning, I had one thought. There was something in the garage I hadn't seen yet. I returned to the workbench, moving tools aside, tapping walls, even crawling under the old Mustang. I must have looked ridiculous, 46 years old, crawling on cold concrete like a raccoon. But something about that key felt urgent. I couldn't ignore it. That's when I noticed it. A thin seam in the wall, paneling near the back corner, just behind an old rusted shelving unit. The panel looked no different at first glance, but when I pressed gently along the edges, it gave way with a soft click. My breath caught in my throat. Behind it, a narrow wooden cabinet, maybe 3 feet high, dusty, unlabeled, with a small brass lock at the center. The key slid in like it had been waiting. I opened it slowly, and inside was something I never expected. A journal, old leather, worn corners. The name T. Harper was written in ink on the first page. And underneath it, a box, velvet-lined, heavy. Inside that, a faded photo of Thomas standing beside a young woman and a child. Not me. Not anyone I recognized. The woman had auburn hair and wore a green dress. The child, a boy, maybe 8, had the same slanted eyes as Thomas. I sat down hard on the floor. My heart was pounding. It couldn't be, but it was. I opened the journal with shaking hands. The entries were dated from before we met, back in 2002, 2003. They weren't love letters or anything poetic, just small, private notes, records of days spent with Emily, the woman in the photo, and Caleb, the boy. Caleb said his first word today. Emily cried. I told her I'd always be here, but I couldn't stay forever, not with what I've done. I flipped through more pages, each one more gutting than the last. He talked about moving, changing names, and debts, regrets. And then this line, dated September 2005. Leaving them was the only way to keep them safe. Emily understood. Caleb didn't. Maybe he never will. I closed the journal and stared at the floor. My hands were cold. My throat is dry. 17 years. 17 years I'd been married to a man who had an entire life before me. A child. A woman he never mentioned. And not because he forgot, but because he chose not to. That afternoon, I didn't eat. I didn't shower. I just sat in the kitchen with the photo and journal in front of me, trying to stitch my mind back together. I wanted to be angry, but it came out as grief. A second wave, a second loss. The man I loved had died. And now I wasn't even sure who he'd been. I didn't tell anyone. I couldn't. What would I even say? But 2 days later, someone came to the house. A man in his 30s, tall, with broad shoulders, brown eyes, just like Thomas. I saw him through the glass of the front door and felt something strange flicker in my chest. Recognition. Or maybe instinct. He didn't introduce himself right away. Just stood there, shifting his weight like he was nervous. Then he said, "Are you Caroline Harper?" I nodded. "My name's Caleb Monroe. I think you knew my father." Time froze. My vision blurred. I nodded again, but this time I couldn't speak. Because what do you say to the ghost of a life you never knew existed? "I'm sorry to just show up," he said. "I found this address in some papers. I've been trying to understand what happened. I don't want anything. I need answers." I opened the door slowly. "Come in," I said, almost in a whisper. We sat in the living room. I offered him tea, though I didn't make any. We didn't touch the cookies. He told me about growing up with his mother in Minnesota, about the way Thomas, his father, had disappeared one day without a trace. No explanations, just a final letter and an old bank account. Emily had passed a few years ago from cancer, never remarried. Caleb had been angry ever since, not just at his father, but at himself for still caring. I listened. Quietly. I didn't tell him everything, not yet. But I showed him the photo, the journal, the key. His hands trembled when he saw it. "I didn't think he kept anything," Caleb said. "I thought he forgot us." I shook my head. He didn't. He just hid it all, even from me. For a while, we just sat there, two strangers holding the same pain, from opposite sides of the same man. Before he left, Caleb turned at the door. "I'm not angry at you," he said. "I don't even know if I'm still angry at him." Then, softer, "But thank you for letting me in." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "Any time." When the door closed, the house felt even quieter than before. But it wasn't the kind of silence that crushed. It was the kind that allowed something new to settle in its place. Still, I knew this wasn't over. Somewhere in Thomas's life, there was more. For the next week, I barely left the house. The garage had become my second living room. I'd drag out a chair, sit beside the Mustang, and flip through Thomas's journal again and again. Not out of curiosity, but as if I were rewinding an old tape, hoping to find something I missed the first time. Maybe an answer, a reason, or a clue. The entries weren't consistent. Some were weeks apart. Some were just half sentences. "Met with Keller again? It's getting too risky." "If Emily ever finds out the whole truth, God help me." Keller. That name came up more than once. Sometimes with frustration, other times with something that felt like fear. I started wondering if Thomas's past was darker than just a hidden family. Was he running from something? From someone? I took the journal to the local library in town, asked to scan old newspaper records from the late 90s and early 2000s. I had no idea what I was looking for, just hoping some article might line up with the entries. Missing persons, bankruptcy, a crime, nothing. Until I stumbled across an archived piece from 2001 in a Minneapolis paper. Police investigate disappearance of mechanic linked to shady dealership scam. The name stopped me cold. Nathan Keller. I read the entire article twice. Keller was being investigated for running a stolen parts operation out of a garage business. Several employees had disappeared. One of them was named Thomas Rowe, not Harper. The article mentioned he'd likely fled the state. I sat back in the chair, stomach churning. Thomas changed his name, moved to Madison, rebuilt his life. That's where I came in. But why didn't he ever tell me? Why didn't he think I could handle the truth? And what happened to Keller? That night, I locked up the garage, double-checked the doors and windows. I wasn't paranoid exactly, but something about all this made my skin crawl, like I'd started peeling wallpaper and discovered mold behind the walls. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside. I slipped out of bed, heart thudding. Through the blinds, I saw headlights. A car, parked across the street. It sat there for 10 minutes, then drove off. The next morning, I called Caleb. "I need to ask you something," I said, voice low. "Do you know the name Nathan Keller?" There was silence on the line. "Where did you hear that?" he finally asked. "Thomas's journal." Another pause. "My mom used to mention him in whispers," Caleb said. "She said he and my dad worked together back in the day, but something went wrong. After Dad left, she said she never wanted to hear that name again." "Did she say why?" "She said Keller was dangerous." I swallowed. I think Keller might still be looking for him. We met later that day at a coffee shop on Main Street. Caleb brought a folder. Old letters, photos, documents Emily had kept locked away. It was like we were two archaeologists, piecing together the same fossil from different dig sites. One photo stood out. It was Thomas, younger, standing beside a grinning man in a leather jacket. That must have been Keller. "I remember this picture," Caleb said, touching the corner. "I always thought it was just an old friend of his. But look at the date." He pointed, July 2001, just 2 months before Thomas disappeared. "He left right after this," Caleb whispered. We sifted through more papers, and I found something else, a map, hand-drawn, of a garage layout, with one section circled. "This isn't our garage," I said. "Look at the address. This was back in Minnesota." "But he drew it. Why keep it?" We didn't know. That evening, I went home and sat in the garage again. I opened the box from behind the wall one more time, digging beneath the journal. That's when I noticed the false bottom. It lifted easily, revealing something heavier wrapped in cloth. Inside, a second box, a gun. I recoiled like it burned me, and beside it, folded carefully, was a set of car registration papers. The VIN matched the Mustang outside, but the name wasn't Thomas Harper. It was Nathan Keller. My breath hitched. The car wasn't Thomas's project car. It was Keller's. Suddenly, everything made a kind of awful sense. Thomas didn't just run from Keller. He took something from him. The car, the evidence, maybe more. And now, people were starting to look for it. I locked the box away again and sat on the floor, my back pressed to the cool wall. Had Thomas killed Keller? Had he stolen the car to bury the truth? Or was he trying to protect someone? The questions spun like blades. I called Caleb the next day and told him everything about the car, the gun, and the papers. To my surprise, he didn't panic. He just sat, hands folded, staring at the table. "I don't think my dad was a bad man," he said quietly, "but I think he did bad things to escape worse ones." "I don't know what to do," I whispered. "We find out the truth," Caleb replied. "Start to finish." I nodded. "But we haven't gone to the police yet. Not until we know what we're sitting on." "Agreed." It was strange, feeling like co-conspirators with a man I'd only just met, but also comforting in a way I didn't expect. We weren't alone in this. Later that week, I started calling storage companies in Minneapolis, looking for anything under Thomas's old name. It took hours. But finally, a voice on the other end said, "Yes, we've got a unit under the name Thomas Rowe. Opened in 2001. Paid in full through the end of the year." I asked for the address, and that's when I knew. I had to go back to Minnesota, back to the place where it all started. I hadn't been to Minnesota in over a decade. The drive from Madison was long, quiet, and somehow heavy. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, even though no one was following me. Or maybe it just felt like someone should be. Caleb offered to come, but I told him no. This was something I had to do alone. At least this part. I needed space to breathe, to think, to make peace with whatever I found. The storage unit sat on the edge of Egan, an industrial stretch off Pilot Knob Road. The place looked the same as every other facility: rows of rust-colored roll-up doors, harsh sodium lights, the faint hum of highway traffic in the distance. But this one held something personal, something hidden by a man who had once promised me there were no secrets between us. Unit Number 47 was tucked in the back corner. The key slid into the lock smoothly. The door groaned as it lifted, dust falling in streams from the top edge like soft rain. The scent hit me first: old cardboard, motor oil, and something else. Cedar? Inside were boxes stacked neatly, labeled in Thomas's hand. Receipts, manuals, tools, photos. A tarp covered something large in the back. I took a breath and stepped in. I started with the boxes. Slowly, each one was like opening a window into a past I hadn't been invited to. Old photos of Emily and Caleb, birthday cards, notes in a child's handwriting. One read, "I love you, Daddy. I'm 6 today." The edges were frayed from time. I held it in my lap and cried. There were journals, too, more than I expected. Thomas had written so much. Not every day, not even every month, but enough to build a bridge between who he was and who he became. One passage stopped me. "If you're reading this, Caroline, I'm sorry. I didn't know how to bring the past into the life we built. But I never stopped loving either of you. I just ran out of time." I ran my fingers over the ink. It wasn't just an apology, it was a surrender. Eventually, I pulled back the tarp. It wasn't a car. It was another workbench, and behind it, a set of drawers labeled with names and dates, detailed records of every part Keller's crew had stolen. Thomas had been keeping track, documenting everything. This was the evidence. He hadn't run to hide. He had run to protect. The realization made my legs feel weak. There was also a cassette recorder, old but intact. A note taped to the top read, "Play this if anything happens to me." I sat on a wooden crate, heart racing, and pressed play. The tape hissed. Then Thomas's voice, a little younger, but still steady. "If this ever ends up in the wrong hands, I'm dead. I'm saying this to make sure Emily and Caleb are safe. Caroline, if you're listening, I never told you everything. Keller wasn't just stealing parts. He was dealing in something darker. Cars were a front. Trafficking, fakes, identities. He tried to pull me in. I kept records. I kept the Mustang. Not because I wanted it, but because it's got evidence built into it, in the frame. If anyone ever comes looking for it, don't hand it over. Don't trust the police. Keller had people everywhere. I didn't know who to trust. I ran. I changed everything. I met you. And I tried to become someone better." The tape clicked off abruptly. I sat there in silence. There were no words left, only understanding. Thomas hadn't just left Emily and Caleb to escape the guilt. He'd done it because he feared for their lives. And mine. He didn't hide the car for sentiment. He hid it because it was dangerous. And now it was sitting in my garage. I packed up the evidence, copies of the documents, the tape, and one journal, and drove back to Madison with the weight of a different kind of grief. Not betrayal, but loss is layered in sacrifice. It was late when I pulled into the driveway. Caleb's car was already there. He stepped out as I got out of mine, face pale. "They came by," he said quietly. "Who?" A man, tall, leather jacket, said his name was K, but he didn't say Keller, just the letter. He asked if the Mustang was still in the garage. My skin prickled. I opened the trunk and showed him the files. "We have proof. We have names. We go to someone real this time." The next morning, we drove to a retired federal investigator named Richard Abrams, someone Emily had trusted. Caleb had found his number among her old contacts. Abrams was in his 60s, with thick glasses, no nonsense. He listened quietly as we laid everything out. The files, the car, the gun, the voice tape. When we finished, he nodded slowly. I've heard Keller's name before, but this is the first time I've seen anything that might stick. He looked at me. If you're willing to testify, and let me take the car for forensics, we might have a shot at burying this man for good. My hands trembled. Will I be safe? I'll make sure of it, he said. But you need to be ready. Keller won't go down quietly. I nodded. I'm ready. Later that evening, Caleb and I stood together outside the garage, watching as a covered truck rolled the Mustang out of the driveway. I used to hate him, Caleb said, eyes misting. But I think maybe he was trying to protect us. I touched his arm. He never stopped loving you. Or Emily. Caleb looked at me. And you? I smiled softly. He loved me too. Just in a quieter part of his life. The garage felt emptier now, but not in a hollow way, in a healing one, and I knew something deep in my bones. This wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the truth. There are stories we think we know, until a single key, a single photo, or a single truth shatters that illusion. That was what happened to me, Caroline Harper, when my husband Thomas died and left behind more than memories. He left behind a past I never knew existed. I went looking for answers in a dusty garage and found a secret family, a criminal past, and the man I thought I knew fractured into pieces. There were days I felt betrayed. Days I felt foolish. But more than anything, I felt human. Thomas wasn't perfect. He had run, he had lied, but not out of cruelty. Out of cutting himself in two. In helping Caleb, Thomas's son had a life before him. I found an unexpected connection. A stranger bound to me by grief, memory, and all the spaces Thomas had together. Uncovered crimes buried beneath the weight of time, and brought long overdue justice. But this story isn't just about crime. It's guilt. What remains is a quiet house, a clean garage, a photograph of two people laughing beside a car, and a woman standing in the stillness of her life, not waiting for the past to return, but finally, gently letting it go. Love doesn't always leave us in the ways we expect. Sometimes it leaves behind locked drawers, handwritten apologies, and unfinished stories. But if we're brave enough to look, and kind enough to forgive, we can write the ending ourselves. Not loudly, just enough to be heard in a whisper.